when fish and chips was a Friday treat, not a guilty pleasure, and walking to the shops was just part of life? Back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, obesity was almost unheard of in Britain. Our grandparents ate proper meals, enjoyed their food, and never set foot in a gym. So what was their secret? Today, we're stepping back into the kitchens and dining rooms of post-war Britain to uncover the surprising truth about how ordinary people stayed naturally healthy without ever trying. The answer might just change how you think about food forever. Life in the 1950s was still marked by the shadows of rationing, even after it officially ended in 1954. British families had learned to make every morsel count, and those habits didn't disappear overnight. The typical dinner plate looked nothing like today's oversized portions. A piece of meat, the size of a deck of cards, a mountain of boiled vegetables, and perhaps 2 or 3 potatoes constituted a proper meal. There was no such thing as going back for seconds unless you were a growing teenage boy, and even then, mother kept a watchful eye on the pot. The cornerstone of every meal was vegetables, and not the fancy Mediterranean kind we see today. We're talking about cabbage, carrots, turnips, Brussels sprouts, and swede. These humble vegetables were cheap, readily available, and filled you up without filling you out. Every housewife had her own way of preparing them, usually boiled until soft, seasoned with a knob of butter if you were lucky. Sunday roast might feature a small joint of beef or lamb, but the real stars of the plate were always the vegetables that surrounded it. The meat was there for flavor, not as the main event, like it became in later decades. Mornings in a British household started with porridge more often than not, especially during the colder months. Made with water or a splash of milk, perhaps sweetened with a spoonful of golden syrup or jam, it was warm, filling, and kept you going until dinner time. Toast with a thin scrape of butter and marmalade was another staple, and if you were particularly fortunate, you might have a boiled egg on Sunday. The full English breakfast that we now associate with British cuisine was actually a weekend luxury or a special occasion treat, not an everyday occurrence like many people assume today. Working men might stop at a cafe for a proper fry-up before a shift, but this was fuel for hard physical labor, not a leisurely brunch after a lie-in. Factory workers, miners, builders, and dockers burned thousands of calories each day, and their bodies needed that energy. The difference was that food matched activity. Nobody sat at a desk all day after eating bacon, eggs, sausages, beans, and fried bread. The breakfast you ate reflected the work you were about to do, and portion sizes were calibrated accordingly, even if nobody thought about it in those terms. Even though rationing ended in the mid-50s, its impact on British eating habits lasted for decades. An entire generation had grown up making do with limited sugar, butter, meat, and eggs. They had learned to savor small amounts and never waste a scrap. This mindset didn't vanish just because shops suddenly had more stock. Mothers who had stretched a pound of mince to feed a family of 6 didn't suddenly start buying twice as much when restrictions lifted. The careful, measured approach to food became part of the national character. Treats were genuinely treats back then. A bar of chocolate was something you had once a week, not once an hour. Biscuits came out when visitors called round for tea, and you'd have 2, maybe 3, with your cuppa. The idea of keeping a family-sized pack of crisps in the cupboard for casual snacking would have seemed bizarre and wasteful. Sugar was used sparingly in home baking, and shop-bought cakes were for birthdays and Christmas. This natural restraint wasn't about dieting or deprivation, it was simply how things were done, passed down from parent to child without question. Nearly every meal was cooked from scratch at home during this period. There were no microwaves, no ready meals, and takeaways were a rare luxury. The British housewife spent a significant portion of her day in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, chopping vegetables, and standing over the stove. This wasn't considered a chore in the same way it might be viewed today. It was simply part of the daily routine, as natural as making the beds or sweeping the floors. Traditional dishes like shepherd's pie, liver and onions, toad in the hole, and Lancashire hot pot were staples because they were economical and filling. These meals used cheap cuts of meat, bulked out with plenty of vegetables and potatoes. Leftover meat from the Sunday roast became Monday's cottage pie or Tuesday's hash. Nothing went to waste, and every meal was carefully planned around what was in the larder. The act of cooking itself took time and effort, which meant you appreciated the food more when it finally reached the table. There was no grabbing something quick from the freezer or ordering in when you couldn't be bothered to cook. Life before the car became universal meant that most people walked far more than we do today. In the 1950s, only about 1 in 10 families owned a car. By the 1970s, this had increased, but still, walking was the primary mode of transport for millions of Britons. You walked to the shops, to work, to the post office, to visit friends. Children walked to school and back, often covering a couple of miles each day without thinking twice about it. The weekly shop wasn't done in one big supermarket trip either. You'd visit the greengrocer for vegetables, the butcher for meat, the baker for bread, and the grocer for everything else. This meant multiple trips throughout the week, each requiring a walk there and back, often carrying heavy shopping bags. It was incidental exercise, woven into the fabric of daily life. Nobody called it a workout or congratulated themselves for it. It was simply how you got things done, and it kept people naturally active without any conscious effort or gym membership required. If you could step back into a 1960s dining room and see the plates people used, you'd be shocked by how small they were compared to today's dinnerware. Dinner plates were often only 23 or 24 centimeters across, whereas modern plates can be 28 to 30 centimeters or even larger. This might not sound like much, but it made an enormous difference to portion sizes. A smaller plate naturally held less food, and finishing what was on your plate was expected, so people simply ate less without feeling deprived. Restaurant portions were similarly modest during this era. Going out for a meal was a special occasion, perhaps once or twice a year for many families, and the servings reflected post-war sensibilities. You'd get a reasonable amount of food, enough to satisfy, but not to stuff yourself. The modern concept of supersizing or getting extra value by ordering enormous portions simply didn't exist. People ate until they were satisfied, not until they were uncomfortably full. And leaving the table slightly hungry was perfectly normal and even expected, especially for children who were told they'd have room for afters if they behaved themselves. Sugar and sweets occupied a very different place in daily life compared to today's constant availability of treats. Children might get sixpence or a shilling to spend at the sweet shop on Saturday, and they'd choose carefully, making their selection last the entire week. Quarter pounds of pear drops, mint humbugs, or sherbet lemons were weighed out and twisted into paper bags. The anticipation and careful rationing of those sweets throughout the week made them far more special than any chocolate bar grabbed at a checkout today. Puddings at home were real, but they weren't the sugar-laden creations we see now. Bread and butter pudding, rice pudding, stewed apples, or jelly and custard were typical desserts. They provided something sweet to end the meal, but they weren't excessive. A slice of cake with afternoon tea was standard, but it was one slice, and cake wasn't available every day in most households. The idea of keeping multiple types of biscuits, chocolates, and cakes in the house at all times would have seemed extravagant and unnecessary. Sweet things were enjoyed but controlled, naturally limiting sugar intake without anyone needing to think about it. Afternoon tea wasn't just for the upper classes, it was a genuine daily ritual for working people too. Around 4 o'clock, the kettle went on, and you'd sit down for a proper cup of tea and perhaps a biscuit or a slice of cake. This break in the day served multiple purposes. It provided a moment to rest, a chance to chat with family or neighbors, and a small amount of food to tide you over until supper. Importantly, it was a scheduled, mindful moment rather than mindless grazing throughout the day. The evening meal, called tea or supper depending on where you lived and your social class, was typically eaten between 5 and 6 o'clock. This earlier dining time meant that food had hours to digest before bedtime, unlike today's habit of eating late into the evening. After supper, that was generally it for eating. There might be a cup of cocoa before bed, but the idea of raiding the fridge for snacks at 9 or 10 o'clock simply didn't happen. Kitchens closed after the evening meal, and everyone accepted this without question. The structured eating times created natural fasting periods overnight, giving bodies time to properly digest and rest. The nature of work was fundamentally different in the decades following the war. Britain was still a manufacturing powerhouse through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s. Millions of men worked in factories, shipyards, coal mines, steel plants, and on construction sites. These jobs required genuine physical effort, often in harsh conditions, burning thousands of calories every single day. Even office workers faced more physical demands, with no computers, no emails, just typewriters, filing cabinets, and endless trips up and down stairs to deliver messages and documents. Women's domestic work was equally demanding. Without modern appliances, keeping a house meant real physical labor. Washing clothes involved hauling heavy wet laundry, wringing it out by hand or through a mangle, and hanging it on the line. Carpets were beaten, floors were scrubbed on hands and knees, and shopping was carried home in heavy bags. Even cooking required more effort, with no food, processors, or electric mixers. All of this activity, none of it counted as exercise, simply burned calories as a natural part of daily life. People were tired at the end of the day because they genuinely worked hard, and their bodies stayed lean as a result. Do you remember helping with physically demanding household chores? The Sunday roast was the centerpiece of the British week, a meal that brought families together around the table without fail. Every Sunday, across millions of homes, the same ritual played out. A modest joint of beef, lamb, or pork, surrounded by roasted potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, and those inevitable boiled vegetables. The meat had to stretch to feed everyone, which meant carving thin slices and ensuring the vegetables did most of the filling up. Gravy made from the meat juices tied it all together, and second helpings were rare. This wasn't just a meal, it was a social institution that reinforced family bonds and taught children proper table manners. What made these meals so different from today was the absolute focus on eating together. There were no televisions blaring in the background, no mobile phones, no distractions whatsoever. You sat at the table, ate your meal, and talked to each other. This mindful approach to eating meant people actually noticed when they were full. They savored their food, chewed properly, and ate more slowly. The meal could last an hour or more, not because there was mountains of food, but because it was a social occasion as much as sustenance. Studies today show that eating slowly and mindfully helps with weight control, but our grandparents didn't need studies. They just lived it, every single Sunday, creating memories and maintaining healthy habits without ever realizing they were doing anything special at all. Looking back at how our parents and grandparents ate and lived, the secret wasn't really a secret at all. They stayed slim because their lives naturally included less food and more movement. Small portions, home-cooked meals, limited sugar, and physical activity built into every day created a lifestyle that supported healthy weight without any conscious effort. There were no diet books, no gym memberships, no calorie-counting apps, just simple, honest food and active lives filled with purpose and routine. Perhaps there's something we can learn from those simpler times. Not that we should return to the hardships of the post-war years, but maybe we can recapture some of the wisdom that kept people healthy and connected to their food. What do you remember about meals from your childhood? Did your family have any traditions that might hold lessons for us today? Share your memories in the comments below. Let's keep these important stories alive and learn from the generations who came before us. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into Britain's fascinating past.